longing for Christ. If you jot that down, we'll read this text, and I want us to understand how much we actually long for Christ, as romantic and sappy and unmasculine as that sounds. You do long for Christ, even though you may not know you long for Christ. And I think I can prove that. I can at least prove that what you do long for is not what you really want. And I think we're all old enough to know that. And I can emphasize that. But I can say, theologically, I would present to you and posit, I think what Christ is and what he promises, what he represents, and what he says he'll bring, that is what you want. Micah chapter 5, verse number 2, one of the most crazy introductions of any sermon I've ever preached. I find humor in that, even if you don't. Let's read Micah chapter 5, verse number 2, just one verse. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, you who are too, that's the word, to be among the clans of Judah, too little, too obscure, too outside. From you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Now, you've all read that. Many of you are Sunday school graduates. You're Sunday school postgraduates. You know that verse. You even know this is all about David ultimately. Well, that's true, and that's good. But let's just deal with this first line right here, this concept of him coming from Bethlehem Ephrathah. Bethshan, Bethany, Bethsaida, tons of Beth compound names in the Bible. Cities were named Beth this, Beth that. In Hebrew, the word Beth means house. Lahem, it means bread. And you've heard this before, some of you. House of bread. So Bethlehem means house of bread. Ephrathah, this other name for it, is another word that it means the place of fruitfulness. Okay, bread and fruit. If you've been to Israel, certainly with a palate trained in America, you go there, and at least if you're like me, with a very narrow palate, spoiled with candy and hamburgers, a lot of stuff there I'm not real keen on. But if I walked in and I saw a plate of fruit and bread, I can go with that. Matter of fact, that'd be great. On my tours of Israel, when I'm there, that's it. It's a staple. Staple then, staple now. I would like bread and fruit. Ephrathah, Bethlehem, this is a moniker, a title that speaks of something like that everyone wants. And yet, I just want to tell you all the way back to Genesis 35, this was a city that was not even a city, a village that was not associated with that. Matter of fact, if you were to ask anyone in the Old Testament, what does Bethany remind you of? Bethlehem remind you of? Right? You would say, well, it's a really sad place. Matter of fact, there's a famous tomb there. You know whose tomb is there? Think now, Sunday school grads. The tomb of Rachel. Right? Rachel died there. And how did she die? Tragic. She died how? Can you imagine this? Maybe some of you know someone died in childbirth. Doesn't happen so much anymore, but that's really sad. Matter of fact, as she was dying and she'd given birth to this son, they say, wait, don't die, you have a son. She says, I'm going to call him son of sorrow. Right? And she dies. Right? This is Jacob's wife. Jacob's wife, right? Israel, the head of the nation. And his wife that he loves, that he met there, the shepherdess who was beautiful, and he loved her so much, she dies in childbirth. And they bury her there. And to this day, by the way, Bethlehem is a hotly contested place. The tomb of Rachel, all you have to do is look this up on Wikipedia and read through that, or any document or journal article about Rachel's tomb. It's filled with frustration. The Jews, of course, it's like their third or fourth most holy site. The Muslims, Christians, everyone wants access to this. It's in the West Bank, of course, which it's a mess. One of the most famous checkpoints is there, and it's up. I mean, when I've been there, and I've been there several times, and it's a scary place. It's a lot of anger, a lot of frustrations. Go there now, a lot of graffiti, a lot of hostility between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not a happy place now. It was a sad place in history. Oh, by the way, in the time that Matthew describes the birth of Christ, he describes and reminds us of Rachel, and he talks about Rachel weeping for her children. And her children there they're weeping for was an enlistment of the passage about her crying, and this was a prophecy of the Old Testament in Jeremiah 31, the idea of her weeping and the sadness of Bethlehem, because of Herod slaughtering the babies there. The wailing and weeping of people because all these children 2 and under were just killed. I mean, this is a place that is not a happy place. Not only in the birth of Christ story, not in the Old Testament story. I mean, you want to talk about a feast of bread and fruit. It doesn't seem to live up to that. So here's a little tag on the present that says bread and fruit. This will be great. The wrapping looks horrific. It looks sad. It looks ugly. It looks bad. It looks negative. But inside, I'm supposed to understand there's something great there. Well, you need to look past the wrapping. As a matter of fact, the surprise and jarring nature of the wrapping of Christ being born in a place like this should get you to say, I should approach the understanding of what's inside the present, the Christ child, and I should really not just hop on to whatever my easy, intuitive thoughts are about that child. I got to think hard. Matter of fact, I got to get my head around whatever the truth of that person is. Who was predicted, by the way, it says in Isaiah, to be the person who was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. I mean, we don't even want the personage of Christmas to be sad. Jolly old Saint Nick would work for us. We don't want Christ, who went around without a house, without a home. Luke 9 saying, I don't have a place to lay my head. He's always there lamenting. He goes, bring him lunch. I can't eat. I got work to do. In John 4, he goes up on a ridge and looks down at Jerusalem and he starts weeping and crying. He's like, what's wrong with this guy? Everything about him is the description in Scripture that would make you think, well, I know there's value there, but it's hard to see that value because what I want, it's not there. It's not immediately perceivable. And that's where I'd like to get you to think. God provides a child, and he says, this child, to quote a contemporary prophet of Micah, Isaiah, this child, this mighty God, everlasting Father, wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, he is this eternal being that is now born, and this child is going to be the answer to everything. Matter of fact, look down a few verses here. Verse 4. He shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. So this is going to be a powerful leader, everyone's going to be like submitting to him. And there's majesty. That's a bigger word than you think, of the glory of this leader. And what about his flock? What about his people? They shall dwell secure. They shall dwell secure. Did you lock your car in the parking lot? What? Did you lock your car? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? You're at church, man. Nobody's going to steal anything from you. Do you know, I was preaching one day, and so my office was down the hall. Someone went into my office, into my briefcase, stole my wallet. I preached twice. By the time I got off the platform, noticed my wallet was gone. They'd run up all my credit cards. My wallet can't even dwell securely in the study of the pastor. I'd like to think we're doing living by rules. We got leadership standards. We have, ideas and expectations of highly committed participants. I'm doing all we can to make this a great place, and I can't even make sure that my credit card doesn't get ripped off at church. None of us dwell secure. And yet there's a promise of one who's coming that just by being enthroned, everything's going to be copacetic. You will not even have an alarm system on your house. You will not lock your cars. If you're a locksmith, figure out something else to do in the kingdom. There's no need for that. Matter of fact, I should read the rest of this. It's so good. But I want to go back to chapter 4. It says, for now he shall be great. How far? Just in our little enclave in the walls of the compound of the church? No, to the ends of the earth. And he himself, just he being there, him coming and leading, he will be their peace. Now, that's a summary of what he's unpacked in chapter 4. I got to have you at least look at chapter 4. Micah chapter 4, verse 1, it shall come to pass in the latter days. This is not now, and it's not even in Micah's time. And it, by the way, it's not even in the first century, 700 years later. We've yet to see this. That the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. And we're not talking about tourists on tourist buses. And many nations shall come and say, let us come and go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion, now that whenever we start kicking Jerusalem and the mountain of God into the word Zion, we're not just talking about one of the 7 hills of Jerusalem. We're talking about this idealized place where the Messiah is reigning, the capital city of Christ when he takes his power and exercises that power and shepherds his flock, not with some little group of people in little churches around the world with their wallets getting ripped off while they preach. We're talking about a worldwide peace because the ruler is ruling. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Law, God's going to speak. You do this. The jurisdiction, the ability to speak the law to the people is going to be fully realized and fully exercised. He's going to judge between many peoples. He'll arbitrate between, mediate. He'll make things right. He shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. They're going to sit there and they're going to say, what does the CEO of the world say? Whatever he says, talk about binding arbitration, right? Here it is. You will do what the king says. And they shall, because no one's going to say, well, he may have said that, but I'm going to break the law. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, right? Their spears into pruning hooks. Like no locksmiths, now there's no weapons, right? There's no swords. Nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Can you imagine? Not a standing army among any of the nations of the kingdom when the ruler steps up to lead. How good is that? Well, they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. That's the picture, by the way, of the blessing in the Old Testament of someone who has a luxurious life. I've got my backyard with the palm trees and the chase lounges, and everything is peaceful and prosperous. And no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. I'll bet you have locks. I bet there are times you're afraid, given the circumstances of life. I'll bet there's plenty of things that remind you that if a nation's going to be strong and peaceful, it better have a strong army, unless you're a crazy thinker. You know that all of these things are important. Why? Because of the evilness of men's hearts. Evil has to be restrained. The best of what we could offer. Put your favorite candidates at the city council, with the county supervisors. You get Newsom out, put your perfect guy in place there. Go to D.C., right? I'm assuming you're not a big Biden fan. Put your favorite president in there, right? And then let's go to the United Nations and do whatever you want to with that so that you can have something that you think should be going on in the world and make this world with all the people, make it what you want it to be, and let's see how that goes. Here's the indictment. Jesus was born in Bethlehem to indict, right, all of us for investing in something that doesn't work. We are hoping in something that cannot provide. We are wanting the satisfaction of fruit and bread from something that cannot provide that. You can't build higher walls and bigger gates and better alarm systems. You can't have bigger armies. You can't do any of the things you think that are going to make you happier, which is usually more money, better health. None of it will provide. Solomon, by the way, speaking of the lineage of David, had all of that. He wrote a book about it, and here was the line, and I know you know it: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's all chasing after the wind. I have everything. I have sex with as many beautiful women as I want. I have all the money I could possibly want. Talk about sitting under my fig tree here. I've got all the gardens, all the plants. I got all the servants. I got everyone waiting. I got gold galore. I got everything. And he says, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Because here's the thing, you're old enough to know that even if you won the lottery, you understand your life would not be what you want it to be, which includes just a little bit of what we just read here. You want all the things that are here. And here's my point. You, at the core, desire Christ, even if you don't know that Christ is the means to get it all. Jesus comes on the scene, and he says in John 6, he's talking to people that had just had their stomachs filled. They came to him because he heard he could turn a sack lunch into a huge feast. And he says, you didn't come to me, right, for what you need to come to me for. You came to me because you got your bellies filled, and you want to sit back on the rolling hills of Galilee here, on the Sea of Galilee, and you want to sit there with that full feeling that you feel, with the afternoon siesta. That's what you want. He said, but you don't get it. He said, all that was a sign to show you something. And here now he says it, speaking of Bethlehem, I am the bread of life. If anyone's going to hunger and thirst for them, hunger and thirst for me. If you really put your hope in me, he says, right, whoever partakes of me, never thirst, never hunger. Now, here's the problem. If you don't know theology and you don't know sequence and chronology, and if you don't know that one thing comes before the next, you're going to think that that's the kind of thing that we should be offering to our neighbors and friends. Become a Christian and you will be satisfied. Right? So let me help you dismantle your house alarm. And let me take your keys and throw those away, and I'll permanently jerry-rig your car so it's always open. You wouldn't do that. You continue to do everything that you do in a fallen world, even though you have a relationship with Christ, because it is not, has your pastor ever said this to you before? It's not about the here and now. It's about the then and there. What you need to do is get right with the King of Kings, who was born in Bethlehem, in a brown paper wrapping, to prove to you that how you think things ought to be are not the way things ought to be, and how you would do it is not the way I would do it. And I want you to rethink who Christ is, because if you trust in him, he will bring peace to the nations. And you will sit under your vine, and all that you desire will be fulfilled. The desires of your heart are all, in the presence of God, to quote Psalm 16:9, is fullness of joy. But that's then and there. We're seeing through a glass dimly now, and from here to the kingdom, as Paul had to remind the people he led to Christ, we must endure a lot of tribulation. Jesus himself said it. In this world, John 16, you will have tribulation. But take heart. Why? I've overcome the world, which means what? I am the Christ, and I am the one who is going to usher in a kingdom where everyone's going to take their swords and beat them into plowshares. They're going to take all their spears they would use for killing people and protecting their nation, and they're going to go fishing with them. That is the world I'm going to bring in. You better trust in me, but you better understand who I am. The problem with the world is sin. I came to solve the problem of sin. And it isn't just, hey, you'll be satisfied if you become a Christian because you'll relieve your guilt. I agree. Your guilt, you'll have your guilt forgiven. It'll be great. But what we're really wanting is a set of desires that cannot be fulfilled by anything in this world. You have to trust in Christ, because the day Christ takes his power and begins to reign, everything will be as it ought to be. Matter of fact, that's a good inverse definition of sin. Sin is that things are not the way they ought to be. How would you like things to be? Right? More money, not going to solve the problem. More exercise, not going to solve the problem. Lower number on the scale, not going to solve the problem. Right guy in D.C., not going to solve the problem. Do I want all those things? Desperately, right? But I know this. I'm still living under the fall. I'm still living with Christ enthroned at the right hand of the Father and not here. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not in D.C. He's not in any place on this earth except through the presence of the third person of the Godhead. But I am someone who's waiting for the coming of the kingdom. I'm supposed to be praying for it every day. That's how Jesus taught us to pray. If your Christianity is not forward-looking, again, you've opened a package hoping that you consume something now. It's like getting a certificate that says, here's the gift, now value this piece of paper. Well, it depends on what the piece of paper says and what it can verify and what it can guarantee. And then I maybe can get excited about it, even though I got to get up and still live my life without the realization of what that piece of paper says. That certificate is not yet cashed in. Christ has not taken his power and begun to reign. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and not in Jerusalem, where they would expect a good king to be born. Because God, I think, wants us to stop and say, none of this is the way you think it should be. Because the way you think it should be doesn't work. Even when I give you David, think about this. I give you David. I give you the best that humanity has to offer. And then I'm going to pull the curtain back to make sure that you know all of his flaws that you don't know about all the other people you think are great. I'm going to show you what kind of lust-filled person he is. He's a stinking peeping Tom. He takes another man's wife. He kills a man to cover up for it. He writes Psalm 51. He writes Psalm 32. He is a bad and sinful man who laments his iniquity, transgression, and sin. Even our best, right, is not really what we want. You don't want that. And yet we're all fallen and we're all sinful. What you really desire is Christ. And what you really desire is for Christ to accomplish his redemptive plan, which is not going to be culminated until he comes back. You want the first coming of Christ to get the certificate so that you can have him come back a second time in glory on the clouds and establish the kingdom that you really want. So what you really need and what you really desire is Christ. You need to start to detect that. When you hate the world, and I trust that you do, and when you look in the mirror and you hate yourself, when you feel like David, who was the best man God could provide for the nation, the best non-deity, here he is, David. And he still looks and he says, I groaned under the weight of my sin. I'm just saying, what we really want is the perfect one to make us perfect, and we will not be made perfect until the glorification and the redemption of our body, to quote Romans 8. We ought to be looking forward to that. Now, we're all going to get around our families and our tables and our trees and presents and all that. You might have a great Christmas. But all it really is a certificate of what is yet to come. Because you're still going to have cancer, or you're still going to have relational problems, or you're still going to have physical problems, or you're still going to have issues with your neighbor, and you're still not going to have as much money as you want, you're still not going to be as thin as you want, and your skin isn't going to be as tight as you want it to be, or whatever your desires are. Never going to be there. Never in this life. What you long for is Christ. Because he's the answer. You, O Bethlehem, house of bread, Ephrathah, fruitful land, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. I'm back here in Micah 5:2, obviously. Too little. I would like you to realize that what God valued was Jesus being born in a place that made this statement about a set of things that are much deeper than the kinds of wrappings we all like and desire. Eliab. What we need to do is to adopt God's values, and even if you're a good Christian, even if you're a pastor, even if you're a prophet of the Old Testament, you can look at something and not see it the way that God sees it and think, well, there's our solution. You need to adopt a whole different value system, and that's a hard system to adopt because the world doesn't get it. You know the history of the monarchy. If you think back to Israel having a king, they wanted a king, and God was frustrated with that, right? And Samuel was frustrated with that. And Samuel says, God, I don't like it. And God says to Samuel, listen, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting what you're saying, I get that, but they're rejecting me. So give them their king. Matter of fact, I'm going to point out the guy that they want, and they're going to love him. They're going to love him, everything about him. He can be taller than everybody else. He can be handsome. He's going to be the guy to fight their battles for him. So go pick him out. Pick the guy they want. And so they picked Saul, a Benjamite. By the way, which is perfect because that's the fighters, the fighting tribe. So let's give them the fighter, and let's make sure he's the most handsome guy in the tribe. Give them what they want. And so they get Saul. And Saul turns out to be what, Sunday school grads? A disaster. A disaster. So then, God says to Samuel, I want you to go to a place, a little obscure town, a town that no one would want to get their king from. Go to a place called Bethlehem of Ephrathah. And I want you to go there. I'm going to send you to the house of a man named Jesse. And Jesse's going to have all these people there, and in his household, one of his sons is going to be the king. I want you to pour the flask of oil over his head and appoint him as the king. So he goes, and he goes to Bethlehem. He's about to put Bethlehem on the map to be something, hopefully, that'll be better than it's the place where Rachel is buried. And he says, okay, Jesse, I'm here, and we're picking a king. And so they all come in. And, of course, they start with the oldest. And do you know what the